Chapter 2. The soft, round midnight jazz filled the night air. Its special rhythms, subtle arrangements were piped through invisible speakers into the living room, where the guests mingled, out to the backyard where couples danced and dined off the lush buffet, finally to the pool area, where the people settled into comfortable patio furniture, talking in low tones among the tiki torches as they contemplated the glowing Japanese lanterns that floated in the water. In the distance, colored lights hung in the nearest trees of the nearby woods, luring the more romantic pairs to rural loving walks or breathless couplings beneath a canopy of breathtaking stars peeking through newly green branches. Despite it all, the romance, the music, the soothing ambiance, Patricia Nelwyn was unhappy, and although she would never admit it, particularly to herself, she felt awkward and uncomfortable as the one unattached woman under 60 at the affair. She hated coming to these things alone. She hadn't planned to, didn't want to, but attendance was mandatory, and a late afternoon call from her intended date had forced the issue, in fact many issues, and she hated confronting her own issues. At 37, she was capable of looking back on the first half of her life with a certain satisfaction. She'd set her professional goals high, achieving almost all of them faster than she had ever dreamed possible. The first woman to finish in the top 2% of her class in a previously all-male university. First in her class at the Peter Brigham Medical School at Harvard University. A board-certified practicing psychiatrist before her 30th birthday. In the last 7 years, she'd had 2 major papers on personality disorders published in prestigious medical journals. The work had been hailed as preliminary to a breakthrough, high praise from a medical community that basically viewed women doctors as glorified nurses. Professionally, life had been good, culminating with her appointment to the staff of the Volcker Institute, one of the top facilities of its kind in the world. Personally, though, her life had been significantly less promising. She was driven, often working 20-hour days, forgetting that a world, or a lover, existed outside her research. She'd never been any good at the social graces that seemed to come so effortlessly to other women. Didn't know how to flirt, never took the time to learn. She had no patience for the games of courtship, the compromises, the sacrifices it took to begin or maintain a relationship. Her loves, and they seemed to come less and less frequently, were one-way affairs, which ended inevitably with angry whispers in the dark and a slamming door, which brought her back to the party around her. Attendance at the quarterly staff cocktail party thrown by the chief of staff at his home was required. It was a time for office politicking, networking, good old-fashioned sucking up. Husbands and wives jointly worked the room, single junior staff members, parentheses, no one could even think about becoming senior staff if they were unmarried, close parentheses, would display their significant others in the best possible light. Always the perfect person to compliment themselves and reflect favorably on the Institute's image of itself and its staff. Patricia had spent days preparing, planning with her typical obsessiveness, the perfect dress, conservatively flattering, the perfect conversation pieces. She'd made a quick but thorough study of the likes and dislikes of all the important senior people, and most important, the perfect escort. Although the relationship had been severely fraying for weeks, she'd begged her current lover, a naval attaché, to accompany her. This was going to be her big move, until his call that afternoon. Now, still tasting the bitterness and anger that she'd poured on the man when he'd canceled, she stood off to the side and watched. To hell with them all, she thought. The conservative, acceptable dress had been scrapped in a fit of fury. In its place, a deep red sequin dress with a low scoop neck and high slit clung to her. She knew they'd talk hell. She'd already pretended not to hear whispers of, "Why would a beautiful girl like that come alone?" But they'd say that anyway. Might as well give them something real to talk about. She nodded politely at the pejorative glances of the senior staffers, then inwardly rejoiced at their other, more covert, lustful glances. She smiled sweetly at the worried wives who clung to their husbands if they happened by to say hello. She nursed her single drink of the evening. Some conventions had to be adhered to if she was going to flout the others, and watched the clock move as if it were stuck in molasses. This was Plan B. Make the best of a bad situation. Put in an appearance, albeit a dramatic one, thank the Chief of Staff and his wife for a simply marvelous time, then a quick exit to the all-night Munich club scene. Hopefully a few hours of anonymous debauchery with a nameless body, an escape from her usual mundane routine, would restore her energy, mood, and outlook on the world. Well, well, a man's deep voice said from behind her, if it isn't Clinical Patty, all decked out in grown-up clothes. She angrily whirled around, then laughed as she recognized the source of the voice. Took a bath, washed my hair and everything, she said with a growing grin. The man nodded approvingly. Helpful hint, though. The slit and the neckline aren't supposed to meet. You don't approve. He smiled. I'm a scientist. I remain open to new ideas. They both laughed as she threw her arms around him. I didn't know you were back yet, Jack, Patricia said, as she finished her drink and grabbed 2 more from a passing waiter. Dr. Jack Clemente, 67 years old, 150 pounds, spread sparingly across his 6'4" frame. Chief of Behavioral Research at the Institute, took the drink handed him. We flew in late this afternoon. How's Jenny? He smiled. Fine. He pointed across the patio at a short, heavy-set woman lasciviously attacking the buffet. She sent me over to keep you company while she feeds. Patricia laughed bitterly as she put her arm around him. How'd you know? I am a trained observer, he said in an intentionally pompous voice. I see things that mere mortals cannot. He paused. Clinical Patty is dressed like a girl. Not just a girl, but a highly noticeable girl. She chooses a design, color, even a place to stand to create maximum effect, knowing that none of these grim-faced bastards likes maximum effect from anybody, let alone its female drones. He paused as a coughing fit came over him. He held a handkerchief over his mouth, then, when it had passed, continued in a noticeably weaker voice. Conclusion. Clinical Patty is off the leash, on the prowl. This leaves us with one final question. His voice grew low and sympathetic. Your choice or not? Not. I warned you about diplomats. She leaned up, kissing him on the cheek. I just keep picking pale substitutes for you until the day you agree to run off with me. What about Jenny? Just leave me the credit cards and the bank books, darling, Jenny said as she came up to them. The rest she can have. The 2 women embraced warmly. How was Washington? Jenny shrugged. I wouldn't know. I spent my time in Georgetown and Virginia malls. Patricia looked at Jack, who was wiping a dribble of blood from the corner of his mouth. She pretended not to notice. I thought you 2 were on vacation. So did I, Jenny said with the slightest touch of bitterness. Jack polished his glasses on the lapel of his jacket. Something came up. Jack Clemente never used few words when many would do, and he never just answered a question. There was always a biting retort or bitter sarcasm. Something came up was so atypical that it immediately set off Patricia's alarm bells. She looked at him for a long moment, then turned to Jenny. Okay, she said slowly, what happened? We're there 3 hours, Jenny said readily, just unpacking, when Jack gets a call from someone in the Pentagon. Some damn assistant to the associate deputy secretary. Next thing I know, I'm a mall rat. She gave her husband a dirty look. Jack, he spends every day locked up in some kind of stupid meetings. Now Patricia was really intrigued. So, old pal, she said, nudging him, what gives? Jack smiled slightly, gave his wife an annoyed look, then turned back to the young woman. You know how it goes, Patty. The U.S. government gives us over half the Institute's grants and aid. Somebody over there gets a harebrained idea they call the Institute, and the Institute calls me. He paused. It's a bitch being indispensable. How would you know? His wife chimed in as she covertly handed him a clean handkerchief. Patricia noticed but said nothing. It was an open secret that Jack had cancer, but he had yet to announce it officially, and his colleagues respected his privacy. Besides, at the moment Patricia was far more concerned with the tone of his voice. It reeked of importance, of new challenges, of something very special. And she needed something special in her life right now. It couldn't be a relationship, it might as well be work. Jack pretended not to notice the intense stare he was getting from Patricia. He looked out at the partygoer, sipped his drink, finally gave in and turned back to her. I assume that's not uncontrollable lust in your eyes? He paused. All right, but just between us, right? Of course. I mean, it's the Chinese water torture for you if you ever give. He stepped closer to her. Looking around as he did, there's something special coming up. His voice dropped low and conspiratorial. Nobody wants to talk about it openly, but it's getting the Defense Department's highest priority. Virtually unlimited funding, not to mention the tightest security. They're dumping it in our laps and demanding miracles overnight. He looked down at his younger colleague. Her eyes were wide open. She was absolutely still, hanging on his every word. After a moment of silence, Patricia pressed him. Come on, what's it all about? She said in an excited whisper. Jack looked embarrassed. I've really said more than I should have. What field? She pressed. Well, I could never turn down a beautiful woman. You never had the opportunity, his wife said between forkfuls. He gave her a dirty look. Remember the Eisenrich study and the effects of prolonged stress on type A3 personalities? She nodded eagerly. Aberrant behavior reflexes, decompensation lability syndrome, phased atavistic tendencies, that kind of stuff. Jack nodded. The project concentrates in those areas. He stopped, as if he'd said too much. Generally in those areas, you understand? Geez, she whispered. ABR, DLS, phased atavism. Her voice seemed far away. How many of the conditions manifested in how many subjects? 5? 10? 15? All in one. She stared off into the trees as the exciting prospect washed over her. 1, she said dreamily, all in one. She quickly turned back to her boss. That's my field, Jack. You know that. You've got to let me in on this. What's it all about? How do I get inside? Jack held up his hand. It's not my call. Staffing decisions will be made by the chief in consultation with the Department of Defense project manager. Patricia's mind was racing. She didn't notice as the young couple, both of whom were on staff, came walking by. Mrs. Clemente, the husband said. Jack, great dress, Patty. Patricia suddenly looked down at herself. She let out a quiet yelp. The chief decides? Shit. She paused, shaking her head. Tonight, of all nights, I had to give my libido a day pass. She looked up at Jack. What can I do? Jack laughed. Wearing that rig, all I can suggest is that you sleep with him, he said jokingly. Jenny shook her head. I'm afraid she isn't his type, she said, or his proclivity. Patricia's eyes darted everywhere. She tried to think of something. I've got to be part of this. Got to. Her voice trailed off as she suddenly looked up at Jack. Project manager. What? He said between sips of his drink. You said it's the chief's decision in consultation with the DoD project manager. Who's that? How do I get to him? Jack looked around the yard, finally spotting the person he was looking for. He nodded toward him. By walking 7 meters in that direction. Patricia spun around, scanning everyone within 25 feet of them. Which one? That rather self-important looking gentleman by the buffet. Navy suit, red power tie. Jenny added casually. He flew back with us. Without taking her eyes off the man, Patricia reached over and took the older woman's plate. Jenny, you look starved, she said distractedly, without turning away. Let me go get you some more. She started across the yard. Jenny watched her go. I didn't much like doing that, Jack. He shrugged. Orders are orders. She looked up at him. Is all this game playing really necessary? Jack looked over at Patricia as she approached the man by the buffet. He seems to think so. Patricia quickly gathered her thoughts as she approached the food-laden table and carefully studied the man in the blue suit. In his 50s, he was tall, 6'5", maybe taller, powerfully built. His shoulders bulged the seams of his off-the-rack suit jacket. A deeply tanned, heavily lined face with dark circles under otherwise clear eyes. His posture was ramrod straight, weight evenly distributed, wearing mid-range black leather shoes with laces, polished to within an inch of their life. In an instant, she realized he was line military, not a civilian DoD employee. And he was sniffing at the plate the waiter had just handed him. She smiled as she casually walked up to him. There's a door prize for the person who can come closest to identifying the main entree. He looked over at her briefly, then back to his plate. "I don't have a clue," he said in a confused voice, "and I'm afraid to ask." She cursed herself for forgetting to ask Jack the man's name. Dr. Medell's specialty is 15th century German cuisine. It can get a bit bizarre. She slowly played at putting some salad on her plate. "Who's Dr. Medell?" he asked as he put his plate down. "Head of the greenhouse. You mean he's the gardener?" He turned to her with a quizzical expression. She laughed what she desperately hoped was an alluring laugh. "No, that's just what we call it. It's actually the Center for Vegetative and Catatonic Subjects. They put him in charge of the refreshments this year." "They have burgers back in 15th century Germany?" He paused. "My name's Alex Beck, by the way." Patricia Nelwyn. Damn, she thought I should have said Patty. They shook hands. She felt the hard callus along the edge of his right hand. "I don't recall seeing you around here before," she said simply. "I just arrived today." He looked out at the party. "In fact, other than Dr. Tabert and Dr. Clemente, you're the only person here I've met. Are you connected with the Institute?" Finally, an opening she could use. "I work in the Behavioral Research Center with Jack Clemente," she said eagerly. He seemed suddenly interested. "Really? For the last 4 years. Beck gestured at a nearby table. They walked over and sat down. "I may be doing some work with some of your people," he said as he stopped to wait her. He handed Patricia a glass of champagne and took a beer for himself. "That's why I'm here." "Well, if behavioral research is what you're looking for, we are the best in the business." She kicked herself in the ankle for sounding like a PR flag. "That is, we have some of the best minds in the business." Beck smiled at her obvious discomfort. "Are you one of them?" She tried to remember how to sound a mirror. "I like to think so," she said in a semi-modest tone. "Oh, come on," he prompted. "You can do better than that." "To hell with your mirror. If I wasn't," she said in a firm voice, "I wouldn't be here." He took a long drink of his beer, then looked at her with the most piercing stare she'd ever seen from a non-psychotic. At least didn't seem psychotic. "What do you know about unlearning instinctive behavior?" Something about the stare bothered her, so she decided to back off a little bit until she had a better handle on the man. "It's an odd question for a garden party." The stare was unrelenting. "You said you were one of the best. Prove it." A regretful look passed over his face. "I'm sorry, I get carried away sometimes." He took another swig of his beer. "It's a tough question to ask a nurse." All game-playing hesitancies and ambitions were instantly brushed away. "Doctor," she said in a low, angry voice. "Excuse me." MD, PhD, and almost a decade of clinical experience with some of the toughest psychopathologies you or anyone else could ever come up with. She was angry at Beck, at the naval attaché, at the misogynistic medical establishment, at men in general. "It is so damn condescending," she said as she leaned forward, "for you, for anyone, to just blithely assume that any woman working in a medical establishment is a nurse. I don't look at you and automatically assume that you dig ditches for a living." To her surprise, Beck was smiling. "I stand properly chastened." His smile embarrassed her. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "You just pushed one of my buttons at the wrong time." She paused. "What was your question?" "Unlearning instinctive behavior. Is it possible?" "Sure." Pavlov extended out to the nth degree. Anybody can be conditioned to do anything. "What about survival behaviors?" "Why not? Same principle. Maybe harder to do, but the idea is the same." The smile disappeared from Beck's face. "How?" Patricia had pulled herself back together. Now she recognized a chance to impress the man. 2 ways. 1, behavior modification using positive and negative stimulus, like touching a lit light bulb. Survival instinct and experience prevent us from doing that, right? Right. So, you give the subject an even more unpleasant experience than being burned by the bulb every time he refuses to touch it. Then give an overwhelmingly pleasant experience when he does. After a while, if the positive reinforcement is strong enough, he'll go around looking for bulbs to touch just to get the reward. And be left with charred hands. She shrugged. An unfortunate byproduct. Beck seemed deep in thought. "What's the other way?" Chemically induced post-hypnotic suggestion. Plant an idea deep enough in a subject's subconscious, and they'll happily put a shotgun in their mouth and pull the trigger, just because they've become convinced that it'll clear up their sore throat. The problem with both your suggestions, doctor, he stressed the word, is that either way, you're left with an essentially deformed, vulnerable individual. Something in his tone struck her as odd. In what sense? She had completely forgotten the reason for her conversation with him. Beck looked off into the woods, and when he spoke, his voice seemed far away. Take a garden snail. A snail? As an example, a snail can detect salt from over 100 meters away, the equivalent of miles to you and me. When he detects it, he immediately begins to alter his course to avoid it, because instinctively he understands that if any portion of him comes in contact with any amount of salt, it will in effect dissolve him. Patricia leaned back and considered, what's your point? Although she knew and was considering it already. Beck kept looking at the woods. Remove his survival instinct, and he will eventually crawl out into that salt and dissolve painfully away. In theory, then, Patricia said, as if she were talking to herself, you would have to condition or teach the snail to continue to avoid the salt while removing the other parts of his survival behaviors. Could it be done? With a snail? Sure. A long pause, I think. Beck turned to her. Let me add to the problem. Okay. She was shocked. A tear hung unnoticed in the corner of his eye. 95% of survival behaviors are avoidance, right? Right. But what if you had a subject where 95% of the survival behaviors were aggressive or attacking? Could you remove those behaviors and leave the individual intact? No worse off than you or me when it came to dealing with survival issues. His voice had taken on a pleading tone. The experts would say no. So I've been told, Beck said quietly, looking down into his beer. But, she said as she considered the problem, it might depend on whether the behaviors were natural or had been learned. Dr. Tabbert, your chief of staff, disagrees. She laughed more loudly than she'd intended. I'm not surprised. Beck looked up at her, and Dr. Clemente thinks it would be a long shot at best. She thought carefully before responding. Jack's a good man, a brilliant clinician, but... No disrespect intended, but breaking new ground isn't his strong suit. Beck was smiling again. And it is yours? Tact was thrown out the window and clinical Patty emerged full-blown. Look, I don't know any of the details of your project, but I know one thing, you need me on it. Beck finished his beer. And what project would that be? Jack Clemente's one of the best. I love him like a father. But what you need is someone who isn't afraid of taking chances, someone open to new ideas and unconventional thinking. Really? He sounded amused. He stood to leave. It was a pleasure talking to you, Dr. Nelwyn. He started off into the house. Listen, Patricia said as she rushed to catch up with him. You screw around using conventional therapies with a full-blown DLS with phased atavism, you're going to end up with one of two things. Beck stopped and turned to face her, and they are. She looked him right in the eye. A dead man or another plant for Dr. Medell's nursery. For over a minute, Beck just looked down into the young woman's eyes. Finally, a shadow seemed to pass over his face as he started to turn away. I assure you, Doctor, the latter will never happen. He turned and walked away. Patricia just stood there, looking at the spot Beck had been standing on, her mind awash with replay after replay of their conversation. She had noticed when Jack came up behind her. So, how'd it go? She looked up into his gaunt face. Maybe I can get work as a hooker, she said in a deeply depressed, quiet voice. Jack put his arm around her. That bad? Worse. He took a deep breath. Well, at least you have the dress for it. The next morning, her mood having plummeted still further, seething with anger directed against herself, she wandered down an institute corridor toward the main elevator banks. She was distracted as she tried to continue her analysis of her conversation with Beck. It was an interesting challenge. All the current thinking on rehabilitating violent tendencies held to a single theme. Remove those tendencies, use therapy, medication, conditioning, or surgery, and you have succeeded, no matter the subject's capability to cope with the world thereafter. She'd seen the results of those treatments. Those washed out, colorless, emotionally neutered individuals were, in Patricia's mind at least, worse off than when they had manifested their violence. But society was deemed better, or at least safer, for their change. She stepped into the empty elevator, pushing the button for her office on the 3rd floor. "Hold, please." She reached out, pushing the door open button. As the source of the call, a young resident came running up. "Guten Morgen, Dr. Nelwyn." She glanced at the young man, desperately trying to remember his name. "Hi," she returned to her thoughts. "You are presenting today, yes?" She snapped back out of her thoughts. She hated people who insisted on small talk. "What? No," she snapped. The young man seemed genuinely surprised. "Really?" He paused. His English wasn't very good, and he struggled for the words. "This Morgan, Dr. Tabbert, leads 3rd-year rounds. I thought I heard him mention something about you being there." Patricia looked over at him in surprise as the elevator doors opened. She hurried out. After the party, she'd skip the clubs, preferring instead to head home and drown her troubles in Kahlua. She'd awakened that morning, still in her dress, 30 minutes after her alarm had rung. It was possible that in the anger, frustration, and liquor, she'd forgotten. She kept her head down as she headed for the safety of her office. "Dr. Nelwyn." She stopped as a nurse came over to her. "Hi," Patricia said quickly. "I'm just gonna pop into my office, right? Be right with you." The nurse put a restraining hand on her shoulder. "You don't have time. The chief's been paging you for the last 20 minutes. "Shit." "It's okay. I called and said you were dealing with an emergency." Patricia nodded her thanks. "You're a lifesaver." She smoothed her baggy slacks and loose blouse. After checking her severely tied back hair, she turned to the nurse. "I look all right?" "Fine," the woman smiled, "but I think I like the sequins better." Patricia grimaced as she headed back down the corridor. In the elevator, she mumbled to herself, "Rounds? So I thought those were—" A pause. "Rounds? Of course. It's just that a patient had a crisis, and I—" She took a deep breath as the elevators opened on the top floor. The blue carpet, pale green walls, and soothing music always seemed, in some subliminal way, to make the walk down the long corridor much longer than it actually was. All the way, she concentrated on keeping her posture perfect, not looking to either side. She smiled softly at the woman behind the desk at the far end, who stared menacingly back in return. "Good morning, Mrs. Lott," Patricia said, as she approached the rather masculine woman. "Doctor," she picked up her phone and quickly dialed an intercom exchange. "Dr. Nelwyn, sir." A pause. "Of course, sir." She looked up at Patricia. "You may go in immediately." Not good, Patricia thought. Tabbert always keeps junior staff waiting. She walked through the door, closing it behind her. Dr. Klaus Manfred Tabbert, Chief of Staff of the Volker Institute, sat behind his highly polished, oversized desk, smiling pleasantly. The desk's surface was bare, not an inch of its mirror-like surface covered by a loose sheet of paper, the slightest blemish or smear. It reflected the light back toward Tabbert, creating a halo effect. Junior staff constantly debated whether the halo was an unintentional result or the conscious attempt of the chief to make clear his godhood to subordinates. Either way, it was effective. "Good morning, Dr. Nelwyn." "Good morning, sir." She sat down in the indicated chair. It was soft cushioned, causing anyone sitting in front of the desk to drop below Tabbert's head level, so that one had to look up to talk to him. "I'm sorry that I was unable to respond to your original